It's July 23. Ukraine Media Center starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko, and let me remind you that now we work in cooperation with Suspilne in a comfortable community space called Urban Space 500. And now we will be talking about the currency exchange rates and how our citizens can preserve their savings. Our guest today is Andriy Dubas, president of the Association of Ukrainian Banks. Good afternoon. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Well, the first question is the currency exchange rate. Now, the dollar to hryvnia rate is over 41 hryvnia. So what are your expectations? Is it going to continue growing by the end of this year? Well, it's a complicated question. It's difficult to answer it simply. If we check back history, today's situation from the economic point of view, from the economic position, economic perspective, is quite normal for Ukraine because those challenges that we're facing when Russia had attacked us, and in case of the absence of this international consortium, international support, our economic indicators such as inflation, currency exchange rate, they would be way, way worse. I don't want to call numbers in order not to manipulate or in order for them not to be used in some headlines, but now Ukrainian budget, half of it is filled by our taxes of the citizens and businesses, and another half of the budget is being filled at the expense of our foreign partners. So let's just imagine where we could have taken that money without that coalition of powerful states of the civilized world who stand on the Ukrainian side. So let's get back to the currency exchange rate. The National Bank of Ukraine, starting from the 22nd year, from the year 2022, implemented a number of activities to stabilize the situation, again, to protect it against those shocks that we were facing during the invasion. Those were restrictions on the currency transfers, on capital transfers, on the currency exchange rate, and other indicators and parameters. Us, as the citizens of our country, the businesses who work in the country, always perceive the restrictions in a negative manner, but here the regime of this stampede was restricted in order not to develop this spiral. And you know, when this excessive demand calms down, you may let go of the restrictions. You may lift them without any significant jumps, so to say. And the National Bank was acting in quite a reasonable manner, and I can evaluate the results pretty good. I mean, even foreign specialized editorials evaluate the effects produced by the National Bank of Ukraine quite good as well. Now we have a situation where we don't have hyperinflation, we don't have national currency stagnation, we have operating banking services. I'm not saying the word business because I'm calling it service because we use banking services. I mean, again, I stay away from that term business because it may sound negative. So again, the currency exchange rate, the National Bank of Ukraine gradually started lifting the restrictions starting from October, if I'm not mistaken, of 2023. That was the first time that there was a liberalization of foreign currency restrictions lifted. Well, we've withdrawn from the fixed rate. You remember the rate was fixed at the rate of 36.56 in summer 2022, and then that restriction was lifted in October 23 to make sure that the market can balance the situation, because us as a country, we have some seasonal factors. Sometimes during certain periods there is an inflow of foreign currency into the country that creates an excessive amount of it inside the country, and when the businesses need to procure currency exchange rate, the demand is growing for foreign currency. That increases its price and respectively the exchange rate against hryvnia. So some of those restrictions that were lifted by the National Bank, basically the biggest package of currency liberalization, happened in the autumn of 2023. A lot of experts pointed it out, and I think too that it influenced positively on the exchange rate of the Ukrainian hryvnia. Yeah, but at the same time, it crossed that limit of 40 hryvnias and then 41. On the other hand, why the demand for the foreign currency is growing? Within the last 2.5 months, we've increased the import of energy generating equipment, in simple words, generators, eco-flows, I mean the batteries. I don't know if I can call the names of specific trademarks, specific brands. Well, basically power banks, all kinds of equipment for utility consumers. So the amount of procurement of buying increased like 9 times. So all of those types of equipment are manufactured abroad, and if it's manufactured abroad, the businesses are supposed to buy currency to buy them abroad. So that's the main factor. And another factor in priority is the fact that Russia continues terrorizing Ukraine. The energy terror is going on, and there is a number of factors that, so to say, do not add confidence to Ukraine. You know, the fluctuations, I mean, the hesitation in this US Senate to provide the aid package in amount of 60 billion US dollars, then the voting in European Union, 50 billion euro under Ukraine facility, and all that epic with delays and postponements. That was another factor that could have influenced the currency exchange rate. So again, today the indicator is a little bit above 41 hryvnia per dollar. But now let's look at this rate in conjunction with the inflation rate, and also what are the instruments to preserve the purchasing power of hryvnia. So today we will be talking about savings, about deposits. So again, today the rate is a little bit above 40, but by the end of this year, if we calculate the average rate within the year, you know, it's like an average figure, it will be around 40.5, something like that, because in the beginning of the year it was a little bit below 39 in February, for example, and then it started growing. So the National Bank today spends the foreign currency reserves to support the currency exchange rate, because import significantly exceeds exports, not because of national bank or government or someone else, but only because of war, because Russians destroyed a lot of our manufacturing facilities. But thanks to the support of the coalition of international partners who support Ukraine financially, basically today's rate of currency exchange reserves is about 41 billion, if I'm not mistaken. It allows the National Bank to confidently smooth down the corners, and given the situation of excess of foreign currency, it may offer some currency for sale and do the other way around in case of high demand. Well, let's proceed then to the savings. Well, on top of the donations for armed forces of Ukraine, which is the best investment in our future, where should the Ukrainians keep their currency reserves? Under the mattress or in the banks? So the classic recommendation is like not to invest your savings in one asset. That creates the most of the risks. I would recommend 3 different positions, like the principle of the golden triangle, golden section, so to say, to mitigate that risk. It could be 3 different currencies or 3 different assets. Someone works with the real estate, some may work with other operations. But again, if we touch upon the issue of hryvnia, specifically hryvnia, today the supply, I mean, in the banks, no matter whether it's a private capital bank or foreign capital bank, so the savings rates that they offer is 12 to 14 to 16 maybe percent. Some of them even may offer something more. And then let's consider inflation in Ukraine that is currently growing because it has a cumulative effect. Today it's about, as of the month of June, it's 7.4%. Different organizations suggest the inflation rate by the end of this year at about 8.5%. And just making the simple calculations, we understand that if you put your hryvnia into savings account, you see that the exchange rate is, not the exchange rate, is that the savings rate is higher than the inflation, then you get the additional income. And if we say whether savings account, savings deposit is something of benefit to the average citizens of Ukraine, yes, it is. It's a simple instrument, and it may be used by the majority. By the end of the year 23, for example, we had quite a good inflation indicator, about 5%, and the banks were offering different interest rates, even 15 or 16%. So basically, you could make 10% of your savings by the end of the year. Now, talking about additional instruments that are gaining momentum and popularity in Ukraine is the internal bonds, government bonds. Today, the interest rate, the coupon, is above the savings deposit rate, but deposits are mostly like the instruments that the citizens are used to, more understandable for them. I mean, I understand that now you can buy bonds even using your smartphone, but today the deposit insurance fund guarantees your return on the bonds. It's convenient because the deposits work in Ukraine more than 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, the trust to the banks keeps regrowing, even using this simple indicator that we use to understand whether the Ukrainians trust the banks. I mean, you always vote with your hryvnia. If you trust some business, you go there and you spend your money over there. In this case, if you trust the banking system of Ukraine, you place your hryvnias there at the savings account, no matter whether it's a government-controlled bank or bank with a foreign capital or private capital. But the amount of savings in the banking sector is growing the second year in the row. Even under conditions of war, I think that it's a good indicator, and I'm taking pride in saying that there are 62 banks working in Ukraine and they have this indicator. Well, the inflation is growing, but at the same time, the amount of money that Ukrainians place in the bank accounts is growing too. So to what extent is it a positive or negative trend in your opinion? Well, if I understand you correctly, the financial capacity is what the Ukrainians can afford. What is their material financial condition? Obviously, the war deteriorated the financial condition of every single Ukrainian. That's my opinion. I mean, I'm even comparing myself and the military that are among my friends. Obviously, before the war, the situation was better. But again, I don't want to sow the seeds of panic because understanding the extensive support Ukraine is enjoying now, and just imagine for a second, if it wouldn't have existed in year 22, 23, I'm sure the situation would have been way worse, and probably we wouldn't be able to sit in the center of Kyiv talking on economic topics, having our cup of coffee. That's why the economic situation in general deteriorated, but why the amount of funds in the system is growing? Well, the first thing, I think that when there is a huge shock, for example, recently we had a COVID shock. There was a lot of conspirologist theories around it. Today we have not virtual, but the real shock when the Russian boots ended up in Ukrainian soil. No matter what Russians tell in the lousy media, we understand what's going on here. And if we sort it out, we will see that there was an outflow of currency from the bank system. Everybody was trying to save themselves. There was no understanding whether the payments would go through, whether the banking sector would continue operating, but cash is classic, cash is king. And today we have this effect of return. People may have kept those money under the mattress, as we used to say, but they experienced the effect of inflation back in 2022. The inflation rate was about 26%. The people started understanding that that money is just depreciating, and they started carrying the money back to the banks. Another big factor, in my opinion, is that today a major part of Ukrainians, not major, but large part of Ukrainians are defending their land against the enemy, and obviously we will continue appreciating it just as long as we live, because as you properly mentioned, we work for the front, and the main question we have to ask them, what have you been able to do today for your brothers holding their arms to protect us all? So again, it's not like people withdraw the money immediately as they get paid. They may keep the not withdraw, but transform them into cash, and the people just keep the money in those accounts. On top of that, many Ukrainians are currently restricted from traveling abroad, going abroad. I cannot call it a positive factor, obviously. Many of us would like to go to the seaside to have some rest, but still, today that money is being left in Ukraine. They work for Ukrainian economy, and it switches on the multiplier effect. And again, we switch more and more into digital format. It's more convenient not to carry any cash on yourself. You know, even before the COVID, I started this challenge not to carry any fiat, any paper hryvnia in your pocket. I don't have any with me right now. I have 3 bank cards that I always use. Sometimes it does create some extreme inconvenience, in some extreme situations, but again, you may always find a way out to transfer that money from your card to another. So basically, our cashless economy is growing. Basically, we have more non-cash hryvnia used than cash hryvnia, and all those hryvnias are accounted at the accounts with the banks. Well, you've already given 2 global characteristics to the banking system: the return of trust to the banking system and the stability. Well, will this dynamic continue? Aren't we going to face the risk of more banks being deprived of their licenses? We've had last year without such phenomena, and I think that this year we didn't have such cases too. Well, it's not quite correct. This year, one of the banks have just turned in their license. It's not like they went bankrupt, but the owners of the bank just decided to cease their operations. So they are entitled to make their decisions on what to do with their businesses, and they've done so. In the beginning of the invasion, we had such a situation when a number of banks were forced out of the market because the owners were Russians. Sberbank of Russia was working in Ukraine paradoxically even after the year 2014 bank forum, and yet another one, and there was another nationalized bank with the Ukrainian capital. It was nationalized by a court decision, court ruling, and a number of banks were forced to cease their operations due to violation of financial monitoring, and then the amount of funds that turned out to be left in the bank allowed them to pay their creditors, their lenders. Well, and obviously during the war we had cases who had to be forced out of the market due to their insolvency. But from the point of view of such challenges, I think that it's not the worst case, honestly. So today we have 62 banks operating in Ukraine, and the key indicator is liquidity. Today our banks are possessing excessive liquidity. The liquidity in the system is definitely sufficient. Those funds are used for lending of population and businesses, for the work with the securities. And by the way, on the side of the Association of Ukrainian Banks, we have analytics section. It's open source. You can use it, and it reflects the statistical reporting that the banks submit to the association, to the national bank. We've put it into visualized form. It may compare banks by the groups, banks against banks, banks against sector, and talking about the lending, we were observing the bottom in the summer last year, and starting from July last year until this moment, we continue observing the growth of loan portfolio of the banks, and the major fraction of this growth accounts for the consumer lending, and let's call it such a big effect for economy, consumer lending, because the machinery and other things that are procured are not manufactured in Ukraine, but starting from the September last year, we see the steady trend for growth of the business lending. So if we segregate banks by the groups, like government-controlled banks and those with private capital and foreign capital, those trends are developing thanks to the support of the government-controlled banks and the private capital banks. So banks with private capital, they continue lending, continue helping develop our economy to a sufficient extent. And basically, those are the funds that, well, yes, but basically, the banks use their liquidity to buy securities, but the fact that the loan portfolio of the banks is growing month to month in Ukraine, it is good because the economy needs credit resources. Obviously, no one ever rescinded the risks. The banks are being criticized for lending the economy to the low extent, but the banks' task is to preserve their reliability, to keep the funds of the individuals and the businesses that are being placed in savings accounts. Yeah, in continuation of these topics, the banks started extending energy loans. So what is the demand? Can it be already evaluated? What are the results of those first days, so to say? Well, it's a new topic. Quite recently, 17 first banks signed a declarative memorandum on the development of the programs at low interest rate, low for Ukraine, to finance all those energy generating sources like solar panels, gas turbine equipment, generators, energy saving equipment, batteries. There are different programs. Obviously, the leaders are the government-controlled banks because their shareholder is the government, and the government vector, the state vector, it may reflect on the intensity of perception of such ideas. And the first credit credits that were extended for procurement of solar panels or generators of Ukraine. Yes, such cases emerged. They are not so numerous in Ukraine, but it's good that we already talk about it in July this year, not in October or November. It means that by November or even October, we will have the mechanism already developed. I think that the biggest problem is that with the biggest generating stations, because if you buy a small generator to cover the needs of this venue that we're sitting in, we can buy it at any, say, hypermarket, but buying a 1 megawatt or 10 megawatt station, you have to make an order abroad, and that type of equipment is not something that is sitting in a storage. I've already said it a couple of times. I was interviewed by some Ukrainian media, so my idea was to get our diplomatic corps involved. Why? Because Ukraine needs to diversify our energy system in terms of having one power plant, say hydraulic power plant, that generates 1,000 megawatts of capacity, is a concentrated point where our enemies are going to inflict their strikes. But now let's imagine it's not 1,000 megawatts in one station, but imagine 200 small power plants, 5 megawatts each. Is it going to be reasonable for the enemy to spend their missiles for every single one of them? The logic is quite clear, and probably we need to use our diplomatic channels to make sure that the states that were procuring such equipment from the manufacturers, if that equipment is about to be manufactured within 3 to 4 months, so that they cede that equipment to us and their order would be postponed, for example. In Ukraine, in fact, we have such a critical necessity to establish such a diversified network. Meanwhile, other states that, or the businesses that order such things, such equipment, they usually use them as the backup power supply channel. Or for example, if the equipment was already, their equipment is obsolete, they may replace it with them. So it's a scheduled maintenance. It's not a matter of survival for them. I think that in our case, our call may work, and I think it may be useful for us because the funds are already allocated for this. There are guarantees extended for this. The banks are ready to finance it, and the final decision is on the side of the manufacturers. Well, talking about the diversification, it's already present in our energy strategy. Ukraine is moving this way along with the manufacturers. So again, let's get back to the banking sector. What is the situation with the personnel, with the staffing of the banking sector? I mean, now that we're waging a war. Well, look, it depends on the profession. Some professions can be mastered quite easily, like sales of the banking products or work in the branches, and there are other things such as financial monitoring, risk management, or other specialized back office professions. To master them is more complicated, and I think that there is a space for discussion here. By the way, in the association, we've established the cooperation with Ukrainian higher educational institutions, which have the chairs of banking management, insurance, securities, and so on, so that when they graduate, their master degree students graduates, and there are institutes in different regions, so that we can coordinate it to make sure that the young specialists who want to continue working in Ukraine can be involved in the operations, and at the same time to make sure that as those specialists graduate with their diplomas, to make sure that they get involved in professional work, so they're able to use and hone those professional skills that they've learned in their universities and institutes. So basically, I don't think that there is a deficit of the workforce in such things in such professions as work in the branches, for example, but talking about something specialized, you have to have some experience, to fulfill those functions that the banking institution vests in you, so that you can be agreed by a regulator again. And sometimes it turns out that you have 10 people to select among them, and you are in advantageous position as the employer. And then if the bid for one place is less, it creates a competition among the employers. It creates challenges for the banks. But again, I cannot say there is some critical situation that we don't have anybody to work. The hybrid form of operations that was tested during the COVID, it yields positive results because people can work from home. There are technologies, there is internet, and yes, a lot of issues are being solved right now. Thank you, Mr. Andriy. I think that our journalists may have some questions on the floor. Well, and in case we don't have any questions, I want to thank you for your profound and comprehensive answers. Thank you very much. Let me remind you, joining us was Andriy Dubas, the president of Association of Ukrainian Banks, and we were talking about the currency exchange rate and what's going to happen to the banking sector in general, and how the citizens can preserve their savings. And Ukraine Media Center will be back in operation tomorrow. Thank you for staying with us. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.